In the morning he still wanted to chase me away, and now he wants to study together? The Duke agreed and told someone to make the necessary preparations. He spoke sincerely to Sienna. "You are my recognized child of the Manhwa family. Don't pay attention to those gossips. Forget it all." The poor girl, hated by everyone in her previous life, had returned to the Duke's palace after being reborn. Faced with the attention of 3 men, Sienna was extremely resistant, especially since the Duke wanted her to forget everything. She found it almost laughable. The suffering she had endured in her past life, the father and son's hatred, the trauma she had been forced to bear. How could they expect her to simply forget it all? He had said, "Forget it," so gently, but how could her wounded heart be healed by just those words? She remembered the pain, how her heart had ached to the point of suffocation. Sienna's violent reaction surprised everyone present. She couldn't stand it any longer and collapsed to the ground. The Duke quickly rushed to her side, helping her up and holding her in his arms. He called for the doctor and gently tried to comfort her, but Sienna didn't want any close contact with him. "I don't want to rely on you," she said, using all her strength to push him away. "Please, don't pay attention to me either." The Duke's pretended affection only suffocated her more. "You're treating me so well now," Sienna thought bitterly, "but will you just leave me to be tormented by you again later? In the future, in this terrifying house, I had innocently endured all the malice and eventually died once. But now, even death has become an obsession. Do you still want me to go through it all again?" Under the intense mental strain, Sienna finally passed out. The doctor who examined her said it was due to severe malnutrition combined with immense stress, which caused her to faint. The Duke blamed himself deeply. He had left the already fragile girl to face such situations on her own. While unconscious, Sienna fell into a dream. She saw her old self, haunted by the belief that she had stolen her sister's magic power. She was tormented day and night by overwhelming guilt, suffering from insomnia every night. To ease that guilt, she even competed with the servants, taking on their chores. But it was no use. The memory of exchanging magic power with her sister suffocated her. Even crying felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Lena once suggested to her, "If you want to repay the Natur family, make a talisman for Grandmaster Asura. It's an important tool to help magicians fight against evil spirits." Sienna hesitated. Her magic power was weak. Could she really do it? Still, proving her worth seemed better than just cleaning up. Full of hope, the little girl made the talisman and gave it to the man, only to later find it thrown away in a dirty corner. At that moment, Sienna was utterly devastated. Her weak magic and hands were covered in wounds from needle pricks. She had poured all her strength into proving her value, only for it to be discarded without a second thought. She recalled what Asura had said to her. "Sienna, I know you try very hard." But her efforts had been for nothing. Of course, she had been naive, believing she could be of some help. While lost in thought, she bumped into Master Michael again. The first thing out of his mouth was sarcasm. "I'm so jealous of you being so busy." He knew very well she was only fit for servant work. "Isn't it fine to just leave here?" Michael sneered. Sienna didn't want to argue, but his words grew harsher. "How could you even think about leaving? You cling to my brother every day. Are you daydreaming?" Sienna knew he misunderstood her, yet she couldn't help but wonder. Was it foolish to dream of being useful? Did she not even have the right to dream? After Michael finished speaking, he left, and Sienna woke up, startled. The painful memories of her previous life tormented her deeply. She looked around, finding herself once again in the cradle of the moon, lying in Lorena's bed. In her past life, how could anyone feel at ease here? She tried to suppress her nausea and quietly slipped out of bed, heading for the servants' room next door. Only in that small, cramped space could she feel some semblance of comfort, even if it was temporary. The next day, Michael did not calm down when he saw the scene before him. Housekeeper Deborah tried to explain that the young lady had a fever and, confused, had entered the servants' room. Michael didn't believe it. Instead of sleeping in a big, comfortable bed, she ran to sleep in the servants' bed. Does that sound reasonable? He began to doubt Deborah's intentions. Are you just pretending to be nice to Sienna in front of my father? Deborah, feeling attacked, was about to defend herself when Sienna intervened, saying, It's true, I wanted to sleep here myself. Yet Michael still couldn't understand. There were clearly better conditions. Why do you want to suffer? Sienna found his confusion ironic. In her previous life, didn't he take her suffering for granted? What was he curious about now? The girl who was despised by everyone in her past life had now become a cherished treasure, loved by the entire family. But the tragic experiences of her previous life had left her despairing of this house. The long-term oppression from her sister Lorena had crushed her self-esteem, making her feel she didn't deserve anyone's love or any good things at all. She told Michael, The cradle of the moon room is beautiful, but this servant's room reminds me of the orphanage. That's why I sleep here. Michael, clearly frustrated, reminded her that she was now a child of the Netur family and had even eaten the pomegranates, a gesture full of deep meaning in their family. But Sienna couldn't feel that connection. She would rather have never eaten those pomegranates, wishing she could vomit at the thought. You think I should be happy because you say we're family? Do you expect me to clap my hands in joy? How naive. Sensing the tension, Deborah stepped in and invited Michael to leave, explaining that she needed to help Sienna change her clothes. Michael, still conflicted, walked out, feeling more unsettled than ever. Sienna suddenly realized she was still in her pajamas, and here was Michael, barging into a girl's room without permission, even though she hadn't changed yet. Thinking about it, his face turned red with embarrassment. After mumbling an apology, he rushed out of the room in a fluster. Shortly after, the doctor arrived to examine Sienna. He declared she was fine, but Sienna couldn't help but feel a pang of surprise. In her previous life, the doctor had always pretended not to notice her condition, deliberately ignoring her and neglecting to treat her properly. What she didn't know was that the previous doctor had failed to detect her case of typhoid, leading to his eventual demotion. Now all the servants knew they couldn't afford to delay or neglect the care of the young lady. Deborah, surprisingly warm and gracious, served Sienna dinner. The sudden kindness felt unfamiliar, but Sienna couldn't refuse, so she obediently ate. As they shared the meal, Deborah told her that something very important had happened today. The Duke had personally invited the tailor to take measurements for Sienna, to have new clothes made just for her. Sienna was confused. Why was the Duke, who had been so cold and distant toward her in her previous life, now acting with such care and attention? The sudden change in his attitude left her puzzled, and she couldn't help but wonder what had caused it. Deborah and the tailor next door were exchanging compliments, both marvelling at Sienna's natural beauty and extraordinary temperament. But Sienna, lacking confidence, couldn't see herself that way. She felt ordinary, just a girl from an orphanage, unworthy of the praise. To her, only her radiant sister, Lorena, seemed suited for occasions like this. While Sienna was lost in her thoughts, a man suddenly walked in, carrying a large bouquet of roses. "Excuse me, is Miss here?" he asked. Sienna was startled. It was the first time she'd ever received a bouquet of roses. She could hardly believe it. "Are these really for me?" She stared at the stunning display. 999 fresh roses, vibrant and delicate. Yet, instead of feeling joy, a sense of unease washed over her. On the accompanying card, the message read, "Wishing you a quick recovery." The gift was from none other than Grandmaster Asura. The surrounding maids were practically buzzing with excitement, marvelling at the romantic gesture. "It's so romantic," they gushed. "Each of these flowers is worth a gold coin. Why are they so expensive?" Sienna, still overwhelmed, felt more apprehensive than thrilled. The grand display of wealth and affection felt suffocating, as if it carried a weight she wasn't prepared to bear. "Then why doesn't he just give me the money instead?" Sienna thought. The cost of attending military school certainly wouldn't be cheap. Suddenly she remembered something. Asura had given her flowers again. Could this have been the same misunderstanding that happened in her previous life? Did Michael think she wanted to marry Asura because of the flowers? How naive. Why would he think that? Could it have been another one of Lorena's tricks? With her deceptive ways, it was entirely possible. After all, Lorena had once tricked Sienna into stealing her magic power. But in this life, Sienna was determined not to let similar things happen again. First, Sienna asked a servant to convey her thanks to the Grandmaster. Then, she suggested sharing the flowers with everyone, explaining that back in the orphanage, gifts like these were always shared. She wanted to spread the joy with everyone present and prevent any misunderstanding with Michael. She didn't want him to think she had any ulterior motives. To her relief, Michael didn't misinterpret the gesture this time, and the servants who received the flowers were overjoyed. Their affection toward Sienna grew rapidly as they thanked her. Finally, Sienna gave the last flower and the blessing card to the tailor as a token of gratitude. In return, the tailor presented her with a sophisticated, gorgeous outfit, the most popular design of the season and the store's treasure, representing the skill of the designer. The outfit was stunning, but Sienna couldn't help but laugh at the color combination. Why does it look like a chick? She thought, trying to suppress her amusement. Housekeeper Deborah, on the other hand, was overjoyed. "With this outfit you can attend school tomorrow," she exclaimed. Sienna, however, was less enthusiastic. "I bet the tutor is still someone who hates my family," she thought. The tailor and Deborah busied themselves checking the long list of clothing: jackets, dresses, long gowns, pajamas, evening wear and capes, a total of over 100 sets. Deborah pulled out a blank piece of paper signed by the Duke himself. "Don't worry," she assured. "Any amount of money can be paid." Sienna sighed, thinking to herself, "We just don't understand the world of the rich." The next morning, Sienna wore the gorgeous dress that Deborah had insisted on. Deborah couldn't stop praising her beauty and charm, but Sienna found the colour far too dazzling for her taste. However, when she considered how the precious gems and high-quality fabric were worth at least half a year's rent if sold, the outfit suddenly seemed much more appealing. For the first time, her heart felt lighter. Sienna pushed open the study door, expecting to meet her tutor. Instead, she saw someone unexpected: Master Michael. The young master appeared as arrogant as always, but Sienna knew he was more affectionate than he let on. Michael had skipped school just to see her. "You should study hard," he reminded her. Sienna stayed silent. "Don't you have class?" she asked coldly. "No one asked you to come here." "Well, I'm too lazy to tell you," Michael replied, trying to sound indifferent as he eyed Sienna. She quietly sat in her seat, ignoring him. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, but he still couldn't resist commenting, "I heard you bought new clothes. It doesn't look rustic anymore. If this outfit is worth half a year's rent and still looks rural, then there's a real problem." Before Sienna could respond, the tutor finally walked in. Noticing Michael, the tutor immediately bowed his head in flattery. "Is this the same tutor who bullied me in my previous life?" Sienna wondered, but she still greeted him politely. Before starting the lesson, the teacher gave them a small test, asking the children to write the letters they knew on paper. Michael began scribbling quickly, but Sienna hesitated. "In my previous life, I practiced writing relentlessly to write letters for Lorena. My handwriting was perfect, but now she was just a child. If I reveal my perfect handwriting, people will get suspicious." As she debated whether to intentionally write poorly, she realized this body had never learned to write properly, so her writing was naturally bad. Her hands kept shaking and the letters were clumsy and uneven. As Michael glanced over, he noticed her struggle and moved closer. The tutor praised Michael wholeheartedly. "Very well written. Truly our child," he exclaimed. Sienna felt a wave of shame wash over her. To be praised by a 10-year-old for something as simple as writing, what a disgrace. The tutor, however, quickly turned impatient. He slammed the paper on the table and told Sienna to practice more seriously. Just then, a man rushed into the room. It was Michael's tutor, sent to take him back to school. Seeing Sienna's subtle sigh of relief, Michael grew a bit confused. "Don't misunderstand," he said quickly. "I didn't come here because I was worried about you." He pointed at the teacher in warning. "Teach her well, and don't do anything wrong just because I'm not here." Without further explanation, the man grabbed Michael and whisked him away. As soon as they left, the tutor's flattery evaporated, replaced by a sneer. His tone shifted harshly. "An orphan, out of nowhere, dares to bother the master again," he muttered bitterly. Sienna immediately recognized him. "This is the same tutor who bullied me in my previous life. He hasn't changed at all." His insults intensified, degrading Sienna to worse than an insect. "You should just go away," he spat. But Sienna didn't flinch. In her eyes, this type of blatant malice was preferable to the suffocating hypocrisy she'd endured before. "It's the wolves in sheep's clothing that hurt the most," she thought bitterly. The tutor continued, basking in his false sense of superiority, mocking her as a mixed-race orphan. Though his words no longer frightened Sienna, she despised hearing them again. Even now, despite being an adopted daughter loved by the family, her orphan status became the target of cruel sarcasm. Sienna, in this new life, had made a firm decision. She would no longer endure such treatment. He, too, came from an orphanage, a lifetime of mediocrity, and in the end he was nothing more than a tutor for orphans like me, probably out of jealousy. As the tutor continued to rant, Sienna cut him off. "Every sentence you speak mentions orphans because orphans are your weakness," she said coolly. The tutor's face flushed with rage, his anger intensifying. He raised his hand to strike her, but before he could, an angry roar stopped him in his tracks. The Duke had appeared in the doorway, his brows furrowed and his cold eyes locked on the man. In a panic, the tutor pushed Sienna away and tried to justify his actions. "It's not what you think. Sienna insulted me first," he protested. The Duke turned to Sienna, and for a moment she felt a twinge of fear. Could it be that the Duke is misunderstanding me again, like in my previous life? But this time, Sienna was done being slandered and hurt. She couldn't let history repeat itself. Without hesitation, Sienna stepped forward and grabbed the Duke's sleeve. Her eyes were filled with sincerity, silently pleading with him to trust her. The Duke was taken aback by her actions. "She still avoids me, but now she's taking a step towards me. She must have suffered a lot of frustration." The tutor still tried to deny the truth, but the Duke wasn't having it. He gave no chance for further defense. With a cold, commanding voice, he signaled for the bodyguard to step forward. The Duke, with a stern look, grabbed the tutor by the collar. "You dare disrespect the daughter of the Nutter family. Prepare for the consequences." The man was dragged away, his protests fading as Sienna finally exhaled, the weight of the tension lifting from her shoulders. She watched as the Duke observed her, his gaze soft but filled with concern. "I really want to comfort her," he thought, but he hesitated, unsure if his actions would only scare her more. Deciding not to rush her, he gave her space, saying only, "Rest," before turning and leaving. Sienna stood there, her mind spinning. The Duke trusts me unconditionally, but why? She couldn't let herself be swept up in the illusion of kindness. She knew all too well how fleeting such kindness could be. If it disappeared, she'd fall into the abyss again. She couldn't afford to get lost in that. Her thoughts shifted. There was something important she needed to understand. She turned to Deborah and asked, "Can you tell me more about the pomegranate ceremony? What exactly does it mean?" She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something significant about it, especially with the mention of the daughter of the Nature family by the bodyguard. But Deborah, just a servant, was not the one who could explain it. "You should ask Master Michael," she said. Just as she finished speaking, Michael burst into the room, having overheard their conversation. In her previous life, he had mocked her, but in this life, he appeared to want to protect her. When he heard Sienna was being bullied, he rushed to her side. However, before he could speak, Deborah scolded him sharply. Michael recoiled, quickly retreating to knock on the door again, this time lowering his head in apology. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced with genuine concern as he defended Sienna with a fierce expression. "I'm amazed," Michael said, his voice filled with emotion. "If I had been there that day, I would have protected you." Deborah, moved to tears by his words, was left speechless, while Sienna, though appreciative, felt a deep sense of helplessness. She didn't want to owe him anything. What she didn't expect, however, was that Michael had made a decision on his own, and the Duke had agreed. From now on, Sienna would study alongside him. The news was truly shocking to her. She had to be forced to study with him again, someone she didn't want to interact with. When Michael saw her awkward expression, he quickly tried to reassure her, thinking she was simply embarrassed. "Don't worry, you don't have to be afraid of me," he said kindly. But Michael hadn't yet realized that Sienna was someone who valued patience above all else and wouldn't allow herself to be overwhelmed by others' expectations. The Duke, too, was more cautious now. He encouraged Sienna, urging her to prove herself. "Don't let anyone look down on you just because you're an orphan," he said. But to Sienna, proving herself didn't matter. She didn't want to build a foundation in a place that could easily be swept away. She refused to place her trust in something so fragile that a small misstep could leave her drowning in uncertainty. Whether others despised her or not didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Michael, however, didn't understand her indifference. He only saw her hesitation and thought she needed more encouragement. He dragged her to school with him, certain that pushing her was the answer. At school, Michael's tutor, Seth, greeted them with politeness and a humble demeanour. Sienna immediately recognised her as the same tutor who had accompanied Michael to school previously, but now Seth was smiling warmly, seeming eager to teach. When Seth mentioned starting with magic lessons, Sienna hesitated and raised her hand. "I don't know how to write," she confessed. Her previous tutor had insisted she practice more, but Sienna wasn't sure how to begin. To her surprise, Seth dismissed her concern. "Don't worry about basic writing for now. You'll be taught by another tutor. We'll focus on magic, and you'll learn the writing naturally," she explained, making the subject seem trivial. "But," Michael leaned in, his voice low, "don't be fooled by her gentle appearance. She'll make you study relentlessly, and you'll be practicing like crazy in no time." Sienna couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. Michael was right to warn her. Though Seth seemed kind now, she knew how quickly things could change. After hearing Seth's words, Sienna felt a surge of happiness. She bowed her head and thanked her, deeply grateful to finally have a dedicated tutor. This would be invaluable for her future at military school. Seth, taken aback, couldn't quite believe it herself. Perhaps she had finally found a good student. On the first day of school, Sienna's attitude of attentively listening to the lectures, so focused that she even forgot to eat or sleep, impressed Seth deeply. After years of teaching, she had finally encountered a student who truly cared. Even though Sienna still struggled with writing, she took notes diligently, which only fueled Seth's enthusiasm for teaching her. Seth lectured on the principles and stability of magic, delving into the specialized field of magical therapy, which is a highly professional skill among magicians. They covered half of the book in one session and even assigned homework. When Seth asked Sienna if the lesson was difficult, Sienna's confident response made her even more certain. This was a rare student. This was the first time in both of Sienna's lifetimes that she had officially learned magic. Unlike her previous life, where her magic power was stolen by Lorena, this time she was free to develop her abilities. This new beginning was her opportunity, and she was determined to seize it as she prepared for her future at Theoban Military School. Meanwhile, Grandmaster Asura stood by the window, gazing into the distance. A pigeon carrying a letter landed in his hand, and he carefully read its contents. Lately, he had been receiving letters from home. His friends had been inquiring about what was going on there, but Asura had remained silent, offering no updates. As he turned to leave, it seemed he was preparing to return home this weekend to the Nacha district. Back at school, Michael had heard that Sienna had been working on her homework non-stop for 3 days. He admired her dedication, remarking that he had absolutely no academic talent compared to her. But Sienna couldn't help but wonder why Michael was pretending to be modest. It was clear to her that he wasn't as lacking in talent as he made it seem. After entering military school, Sienna always aimed to maintain the top position, pushing herself to understand every sentence. But, despite the challenges, she felt immense joy in learning. She enjoyed the independent process of studying, even though her hands were calloused from the constant writing. Deborah also noticed the change in Sienna. Once quiet and withdrawn, she now exuded enthusiasm when studying. However, this change also made Deborah feel a tinge of sadness. She suggested that Sienna take a break and go for a walk in the garden. At that moment, Asura returned. The butler, well aware of why the Grandmaster came home every weekend, noticed him heading upstairs. He kindly reminded Asura, "If you intend to visit the ladies' room, you may be making an unnecessary trip. These days she's always in the study room, focusing on her studies." Asura realized, only then, that his instinct had led him to go upstairs to see Sienna. He hadn't meant to, but his body moved of its own accord. Known for his reason and perfection, Asura found himself losing control when it came to Sienna. When he first met her, special feelings had begun to form, but her eyes, filled with disgust and rejection, quickly reminded him of his past actions in her previous life. In that life, Asura had trampled on her feelings, and now Sienna naturally avoided him. Asura, with no memories of the previous life, assumed his strong presence had scared her and decided against seeing her, wanting to respect her space. The housekeeper, knowing how much Asura cared about Sienna, explained, "Every day, you ask about the lady's well-being, sending letters and flowers, especially when she was sick, but why don't you go see her yourself? You'll know for sure if she's doing well." Determined to check on her, Asura went to the study room, but Sienna was out. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room to ensure she wasn't being mistreated. Seeing the study room, where Asura had spent time as a child, he tried to find a sense of connection, running his hand over the table and chairs they had both used. Just then, something under the table caught his attention. He leaned down in surprise. It was unbelievable. There, under the table, was the wilted rose he had given Sienna again. Asura tried to convince himself that it was just a normal gift with no deeper meaning, something easily forgotten. But why did his heart ache so much? Deborah, witnessing the scene, was also taken aback. As she opened her mouth to explain, Asura turned around and quickly left, leaving behind a simple command: "Don't tell Sienna I was here." One last glance at the wilted rose under the table triggered a familiar image in Asura's mind. The emotions in his eyes were mixed, and he couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. It was as if he had experienced this moment before. Meanwhile, Sienna returned from the garden, noticing the servants rushing around in a frenzy. Michael informed her that a letter had arrived from Count Gia's palace. The Count's daughter was challenging Sienna for the ownership of Jaros, a sacred object that helped humans fight against demonic beasts. Sienna recalled that Jaros was the very insurance she had planned to use as a last-minute escape. Since Jaros still had no official owner, all magicians were eligible to compete for it. In her previous life, Count Gia had always remained neutral, seeking only practical benefits. But now, something had changed. Why had she suddenly taken action in a way she never had before? Sienna realized the reason. It was her. She was the variable that could change both the past and the present. The Countess must have seen how much Asura cared for an orphan like her and become jealous. She believed her daughter was better suited to the role and had long coveted Sienna's position. This sentiment mirrored Sienna's thoughts in her previous life, when, after a dispute with Larina, she had tragically taken her own life. The position of guardian of the Duke of Natta's residence was not just about noble status, it was also tied to Asura the Grandmaster, who many considered the ideal husband. Countess Gia, like so many others, coveted that position. Although there was no official rule stating the guardian must marry the Grandmaster, it was widely assumed. Once Sienna had become the adopted daughter of the Natta family, she had entered a realm where many powerful figures had their eyes on her. She would definitely become Asura's wife Asel thought, unable to stop himself from laughing at the absurdity of it all. But, according to the regulations, he couldn't stop the Count's daughter from challenging Sienna. In his heart, however, Sienna was the only one he truly saw. At that moment, Sienna was struggling to reach books on the top shelf. With the announcement that Count Jin's daughter would be coming, the entire palace was in a flurry of preparations. Every servant had been assigned a task, and even Deborah, the new servant who had been assigned to help her, was nowhere to be found. No one offered to help Sienna. Sienna did it herself. After all, she had experienced similar situations in her previous life. The books, however, were packed too tightly, and as she tried to reach for one, she accidentally fell to the ground. After a moment of noise, she suddenly realized that her surroundings were eerily quiet. Had she become so accustomed to being surrounded and cared for by people that she now felt sorry for herself? She could only force herself to focus, telling herself to concentrate on learning magic. She understood better than anyone how to deceive herself when her heart was hurting. Meanwhile, the servants in the palace were busy preparing to welcome Count Jin's daughter, leaving Sienna alone once again, with no attention paid to her. The girl was hungry and had to find food herself. Relying on her memories from her past life, she made her way to the kitchen, hoping to get some bread to eat. It was there that she unexpectedly met Grandmaster Asel standing at the door. He was surprised to see her in the kitchen. Sienna explained that she was simply hungry. Asel, concerned, asked, "Could it be that the housekeeper doesn't prepare food for you?" Sienna quietly explained that since the lady was very busy, another servant had been assigned to take care of her. Asel's expression darkened when he asked, "So where did that servant go? Why are you in the kitchen alone?" The more Asel thought about it, the angrier he became. It was clear that the servants had intentionally ignored Sienna, and the fact that she knew where the kitchen was showed that this situation had likely happened often before. Sienna, enduring yet another frustration, avoided Asel's outstretched hand when he attempted to comfort her. In her previous life, Sienna had believed that Asel didn't hate her because he was simply cold toward everyone. She had given him the most amulets, hoping that he would at least acknowledge her efforts. But instead, his cold words crushed her hope. "Sienna, your efforts are worthless." Sienna begged Asel not to scold others because of her. She also refused his offer to take her back to her room. Just then, the butler arrived. Asel instructed the housekeeper to take good care of Sienna and deal with the irresponsible servants. As he watched the little girl leave, Asel couldn't help but remember the look in Sienna's eyes. It wasn't just fear. There was also caution and distance. Later that afternoon, the people from Count Jar's mansion finally arrived. Isabel, the Count's daughter, had bright red hair. As soon as she met Asel, she deliberately showed politeness, thanking him for responding to her sudden request. The Count was also by her side, complimenting his daughter's perfection. Asel saw through the deceit between mother and son, but out of politeness he still invited them into the palace. "My God, I've been invited to the natural residence for dinner again. It feels like I'm dreaming," Isabel exclaimed to herself. But Michael, who was with her, found her behavior too flamboyant and couldn't help rolling his eyes. The two brothers, though aware of the Count's real intentions, competing for the position of Sienna's adopted daughter, still maintained a polite attitude and played along with the act. Once everyone entered the hall, Asel was surprised to see Sienna waiting there, looking neat and composed. Michael, without hesitation, abandoned Isabel and rushed over to Sienna. "No need for formalities," he said, enthusiastically talking non-stop. Asel noticed their closeness and felt a slight discomfort. "Are you two really that close?" Asel asked, his voice betraying his unease. He then introduced Sienna to Isabel and the Count, saying, "This is the adopted daughter of the Nature family." Isabel stared at Sienna with hostility in her eyes. "Is this the orphan who is pampered by the natural family as rumoured?" The adopted child, once despised by everyone in her previous life, had now become the family's treasure. The Duke's affection for Sienna made others jealous, and Isabel, the Count's daughter, wanted to claim that position for herself. The Countess, too, seemed intent on making things difficult for Sienna. She immediately asked for the girl's last name. Sienna could sense the ill intentions behind the question. "I'm an orphan, so I don't have one," she replied calmly. Michael, angered by the blatant attempt to provoke Sienna, was about to say something, but the Countess raised her glass of wine, smoothly changing the topic. "Thank you, Grandmaster, for your thoughtful hospitality." Isabel, trying to charm Assel, cast a shy expression toward him, but Assel only responded with polite, distant sentences. Meanwhile, Michael enthusiastically introduced the dishes to Sienna, happy to see her appetite improving. It was a small relief to Assel, who couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy seeing the two of them so close. However, Isabel couldn't contain her jealousy for long. "How lucky you are," she sneered, her anger barely contained. "No one has ever enjoyed such an honor." Her eyes glared at Sienna, filled with bitterness. Sienna, accustomed to such hostile words, remained unflinching. "I am very grateful for the Duke's grace," she said calmly. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Isabel was taken aback by Sienna's composed response, finding it odd for such a seemingly ordinary child to speak with the calmness of an adult. Sienna, however, hadn't expected her simple words would have such an impact. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that one word from her had made Isabel retreat. Compared to Lorena, who was skilled in manipulation and deceit, Sienna still had a lot to learn. But for now, she was content with this small victory. Sienna sighed helplessly, but Isabel misunderstood her reaction, thinking she was laughing at her. "Insolent child," Isabel sneered. "You think you're worthy, don't you? It's clear that only I am fit to be the Duke's adopted daughter." Isabel's words were laced with arrogance, and she made sure Sienna could see her contempt. Then, with an air of superiority, Isabel invited Sienna to challenge her for the possession of Hisar the next day. The room went silent in shock. Even the Countess hadn't anticipated such a bold move from her daughter. Isabel explained her reasoning, her tone dripping with false humility. "Since I'm the adopted daughter recognized by the Duke, I must surely be more talented than her. If we eliminate her, it would be unsatisfactory for me to participate myself. Whether it's me or this orphan, neither of us is likely to succeed, but everyone will see that I'm more talented than her. Let her be humiliated in front of everyone." Sienna's eyes gleamed with intrigue. Things are getting interesting. The challenge for the Hisar artifact could be her chance to escape the tragic fate of her past life. Isabel, eager to usurp the pampered position, was trying to humiliate her in front of everyone to show she was the superior candidate, but Sienna saw an opportunity to turn the tables. Master Michael, however, was beside himself with worry. He jumped up, frantic. "What if Sienna fails and Isabel succeeds?" he fretted. "Then she'll definitely claim she's more worthy of being the Duke's adopted daughter. What if she takes Sienna back to the orphanage and takes her place?" His fears were clear, but Sienna's resolve remained steady. She wasn't going to let this opportunity slip by without taking action. Sienna's indifferent attitude drove Michael crazy. "What do you mean, let's go back to the orphanage?" he exclaimed. "Do you really think we would just abandon you like that? You're already part of our family." His voice was filled with frustration and disbelief. Sienna remained calm, her expression unreadable. Michael, clearly distressed, continued, "You've already eaten the pomegranate. That can't be undone." Sienna paused, processing his words. It turned out that in the Natur district, only those who were officially recognized could receive the pomegranate. It wasn't just a fruit, it was a type of magic, a custom that allowed individuals without Natur bloodline to live safely in the Natur mansion, protected by powerful barriers. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The pomegranate magic would bind her to the Nature family, making her as much a part of their bloodline as anyone else, and that bond could never be broken. Sienna's heart pounded loudly in her chest. "That means I'll be tied to this place for the rest of my life." The weight of the realization settled heavily on her, and for the first time, she wondered if the cost of safety and belonging was too high. Sienna's mind raced as she realized the gravity of her situation. If Isabel succeeded in taking the position of adopted daughter of the natural family, her place in this world would be entirely upended. The challenge for the ownership of Hisar seemed more daunting with every passing second, but Sienna's resolve remained unwavering. Meanwhile, Isabel, sitting nervously in the room, began to regret her hasty request. She could sense the tension in the air. The great prince Assel seemed uncertain whether Sienna would even agree to the challenge, and that uncertainty gnawed at Isabel. What if Sienna actually won? The thought unsettled her deeply. Michael, on the other hand, was panicking. He couldn't stand the thought of Sienna entering the challenge, especially given the potential risks. What if she fails? He asked, his voice full of worry. But the Countess, with a calm yet commanding presence, stepped in. She interrupted Michael's panicked ramblings and reassured him with a cool smile. "Don't worry. You and that orphan are different. I have a mother, and I've already made arrangements with the housekeeper. I will make sure you become the future Duchess." Assel, still clearly anxious, shared his own concerns. What if something goes wrong in the challenge? What if someone gets caught in an inextricable situation? His worry was palpable as he looked at the butler, hoping for reassurance. The butler, ever composed, responded, "Both ladies will fail in the challenge. Nothing will happen." But his words did little to ease Assel's concerns. He was still haunted by the thought that Sienna might face complications. "How do you assess her talent?" Assel asked, his gaze fixed on the butler. "Before she was taught, could you make any judgments?" The butler hesitated. "Only the Duke could make a preliminary assessment, but with him away on the battlefield, we cannot afford to make hasty decisions." Assel weighed the options, the pressure mounting. If we let the challenge proceed, it could bring nothing but trouble. The Count's mansion won't ignore this situation. But Sienna, she will be subjected to so much criticism. I can't let her go through this. Despite his hesitation, Assel's mind was set. "I want to protect her. I love her." His voice was firm with determination, but there was an underlying fear of what could happen if Sienna entered the contest. Michael burst in, pleading for help, but his words fell on deaf ears as Sienna's determined eyes met Assel's. "Great Prince, I want to fight for Hisar," she declared, her voice resolute. Assel immediately refused, shaking his head. "Fighting for Hisar is not easy," he explained. "Only trained individuals can compete." Sienna, however, wasn't deterred. "But I don't need training," she said, confusion tinging her voice. Assel's anger flared. He looked at Seth, who had been silent up until now. "What is this?" he snapped. "Sienna doesn't need training?" Seth, ever the diplomat, stepped in to advise. "All magicians have the right to compete for Hisar. Sienna is no exception." Michael, already on edge, exploded with impatience. "Why does everyone defend her?" he muttered under his breath, his frustration mounting. Sienna stood her ground. "If Isabel succeeds in this challenge, I will fight for Hisar," she said firmly, her resolve clear. The tension in the room hung heavy, but Sienna was determined to take the steps necessary to prove her worth, even if it meant facing the challenges ahead. Assel was stunned by Sienna's calm demeanour. "So you think we'll just abandon you?" he thought, confused by her words. His mind raced. Did she feel she didn't belong in the nature family? Despite all the care and consideration they had shown her, Assel couldn't help but wonder if he could ever erase the unhappiness in her heart. In the end, the Great Master softened and agreed to let Sienna participate in the competition. He couldn't bring himself to prevent her from trying to prove her worth. Sienna returned to her room, feeling satisfied with the outcome. As she walked in, she saw the new servant preparing an abundant meal, clearly expecting her to eat. The sight of so much food piled in front of her made Sienna feel pressured. She turned around quickly, running away from the overwhelming display. She hid behind a tree in the garden, wanting to escape the unwanted attention. Since the previous servant had been let go, the new servant was clearly worried about her hunger and tried to push food on her. But Sienna wasn't interested. Just then, Isabel appeared, her voice sharp and filled with disdain. "Why do you still have the audacity to stay in this household?" Isabel sneered. "Even I wouldn't dare raise my head here. How can we expect an orphan to understand integrity?" Sienna couldn't understand the venom in Isabel's words. In her previous life, the Count's mansion hadn't cared about her at all. Now, Isabel was deliberately trying to provoke her. But Sienna knew she wasn't strong enough to retaliate. Instead, she smiled slightly, her calm demeanor only adding to Isabel's anger. Isabel seethed, her voice rising. "How dare you laugh? The position of the Duke's adopted daughter is for people who are qualified. You're nothing but trash." Sienna, undeterred, looked at Isabel with a touch of admiration. "I also think so," she said, her tone surprisingly sincere. "So I support you in taking this position." Isabel blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Of course you must support me," she said smugly, but then she paused, confused by Sienna's words. "Wait, what did you say?" Sienna's smile remained. "I support you unconditionally. I sincerely wish you win." Her words were laced with a subtle challenge, and Isabel couldn't tell if Sienna was mocking her or genuinely wishing her success. Either way, the tension between them thickened, leaving Isabel fuming while Sienna remained unfazed. Isabel stood frozen, her hand still hanging in the air as the fan she had been holding fell to the ground. Sienna, without hesitation, picked it up and handed it back to her, holding her hand for a brief moment. "Please, take my place," Sienna said softly, her eyes sincere. "I will wholeheartedly support you." Isabel was completely stunned, her mind racing. This was not how she had imagined things would go. What is this kid even doing, she wondered, speechless. Sienna returned to her room, feeling a strange calmness after the encounter. Michael soon came to report that the Duke had returned early. He added that they still had to welcome the Count and his mother once more. Sienna felt a headache coming on. "Do I have to go there again?" she thought. She didn't want to deal with it. To avoid the situation, Sienna pretended to cough, feigning illness. Michael, ever the concerned servant, immediately asked her what was wrong. Sienna, as if explaining herself, mentioned that she had caught a cold while walking in the garden. Michael, deeply worried, quickly placed his hand on her forehead to check for a fever. Seeing his face so close to hers made Sienna blush, but she didn't show it. "You're not in the mood to eat or drink anything, right?" Michael asked gently. Sienna was surprised by how well he understood her. She wasn't in the mood for anything at all. "I also really want to chase them away," Michael continued, his tone sympathetic, "but with my status in the Natal Palace, I can't do it on a whim. But Father is back tomorrow, and it will all end then." As he spoke, he gently stroked her hair, his expression soft and approving. "You're so lovely," he said, praising her. Sienna was stunned by this unexpected tenderness. She stood frozen, unsure of how to respond, until Michael left the room. As the door closed behind him, she finally regained her composure, a strange shiver running down her spine. Who would have thought a 10-year-old child would act like that? She thought to herself, feeling unsettled. The next morning, Sienna woke up with an odd feeling. It was an important day, but no one had come to wake her up. She got out of bed and tried to open the door, only to find it locked. "Someone is trying to stop me from participating in the competition," she realized with a sigh. An old trick? Having faced similar situations in her previous life, Sienna lay back down on the bed and waited. She was determined to see if anyone would come to open the door and try to stop her. She wasn't going to let anyone get in her way this time.